I just want to thank Kylie for what was an outstanding presentation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Kaylee and Pat. We move now to the panel portion of our show. Kaylee's going to stick around, yes, and when we open up for questions, she will be part of that panel. As you know, the topic for the afternoon is the role and importance of youth civic engagement. So what do we mean by civic engagement, right? And why do we think it's important? For whom? How can we most effectively promote civic engagement? And arguably I think, how do we promote it for young people who are most disenfranchised, disadvantaged? And toward what end? So Pat talked a little bit about how we believe engaging young people or having young people engaged effectively promotes their well-being as youth today in their lives, promotes their positive youth development and their transitions to adulthood over time, but also has serious and significant and positive effects potentially for the communities in which they live, the institutions and organizations in which they spend their time, and more broadly for the nature and quality and robustness of our democracies and our societies. So we're going to talk over the course of this panel about youth and civic engagement. We're going to talk about it within the framework of formal and informal education. We're going to talk about it as it can be implemented and supported through policy, and also in the broader context of civil society, of civic action, of participation, of mobilization, and of engagement in both the political and social processes of which young people are a part. So I'm going to give just a very, very brief introduction, too brief an introduction for each of our three panelists, given their quite impressive biographies, but to keep us on time. We have three speakers, each speaking from a different perspective, one from the perspective of research, one from the perspective of policy, and one from the perspective of practice and action on the ground. Our first speaker will be Professor Connie Flanagan. She is a professor in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. She's a developmental psychologist by training and has over 25 years, a long time of experience conducting innovative and rigorous research on youth civic engagement, on youth activism, and on youth leadership. And she has been widely published and has also been an important advisor to a number of organizations, including the World Bank. I think she's just completed a book on the perspectives of youth on the social contract and how they fit into society and the policy process. Our second speaker is Ms. Frances Fitzgerald, who will be joining us in absentia via videotape, unfortunately not video feed. She is the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs in the Republic of Ireland, the first person to hold this post, and she's been in this post only since March of 2011. A social worker by training, she's already been engaged in a number of policy directives to improve and support the well-being of youth and children in Ireland, including one she'll talk about, which is an effort to bring to referendum an amendment to the Irish Constitution that will instantiate children's rights in the Constitution. And then finally, but certainly not least, Mr. Brad Brockman, whom we've met yesterday afternoon, who is the General Secretary of Equal Education in South Africa, a very dynamic and interesting organization, youth-led, focused on improving education and access to education and the quality of education throughout South Africa. And the organization engages, I think he'll talk about, in a broad range of strategies to this effect, both collaborative strategies with government, with schools, with parents, with young people, and also a broad range of civic action strategies, mobilization, political strategies, litigation, and so forth. So a broad toolbox to bring to bear on some very critical issues and challenges. So I'm going to turn it over to the panel. They will speak in turn, and then hopefully we'll have about 15 minutes to field questions and discussion. That will provide a foundation, I think, and an impetus into our smaller breakout groups, which we'll talk about at the very end of the session. So thank you very much. And Connie?
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to the organizers of the meeting. Colleagues and friends, as I get to know some of you, I feel more and more that we have a common agenda and a friendship. I want to thank you in advance for listening to my presentation. This is really just reflections that I hope will generate some more richer conversations as we move into the next discussion section. So I first would like to point out, we can go to the next one, that in naming an agenda for social transformation, there's already a challenge to some of the ways in which education is typically thought of, which is from a human capital perspective. Not to say that's not important, but this cartoon as it represents, education is not merely to get us jobs and make us rich and famous. There are broader purposes, and in naming education for social transformation, some of those purposes, I believe, are things like education expands our understanding of others. We begin to see things from different perspectives if we really are being educated. We develop open-mindedness, tolerance, and trust. And we see that it's in our common interest to find the common good. That's education for social transformation. We could go on with discussing that. Go ahead. But I merely want to draw attention to the fact that we're actually challenging some of the dominant models of education out there in this policy form. Now let me switch to talk briefly about how we might think about schools and community-based organizations, formal and non-formal education, as what I like to think of as mini polities. So traditionally we think of citizens as adults who are able to vote. And in fact, if we really believe in education for social transformation, we must think about those practices that occur in everyday life, in schools and community-based organizations, that enable young people to develop what it means to be a citizen. So I take this quote from a political theorist named Michael Walzer, who defines a citizen in these ways: a member of a political community entitled to prerogatives or rights and encumbered with responsibilities that are associated with membership. I think if we repeat that to ourselves, we can think about, we can evaluate the practices in our community-based organizations and schools from that perspective. So just a few ideas. What do we mean by membership? When young people have the sense that they belong in the institutions of their communities, they're getting a sense of membership in those communities. We have research from the National Research Council in the United States that actually reduces what it means to be a member of community-based organizations to one word: that they matter. That people in the organization say, "I'm glad you're here, and we need to hear from you." So I think we can actually turn that notion of membership and start to evaluate practices and policies. What is it that promotes a sense of membership? We know it. We've heard youth voice and emphasizing that all youth, no matter what background, what situation they come from, what context, their voices need to be there. We have a particular role for adults, if that's the kind of thing we value in our community-based organizations. That is, youth need to be in leadership positions, but there's a role for adults to mentor and coach and encourage. We need certain kinds of projects that enable kids to take on leadership in various, that there's not a hierarchical sense of leadership, but in fact there's multiple opportunities for leaders to take ownership of the organization. If we think about rights, we have obviously the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that spent a lot of time, where people spend a lot of time thinking about what does it mean for children to have rights, and how is it that we enable the development of capabilities. So there's a whole section on nurturance rights, as you know, but I want to just point out that a lot of work went into defining rights to express views, children's rights to seek information from diverse sources, children's rights to associate with others, to have assemblies, to think on their own, from their own conscience, their own religious point of view. these are pretty powerful notions of participation rights that we already have as a foundation for our conversations. Now, I just want to briefly make the point, because the youth bulge has been brought up in the earlier conversation on peace, that if we have institutions in local communities that enable this sense of mattering, of membership, and of having a voice or of having rights, social responsibilities follow naturally, in part because young people will exert pressure on one another to look at the broader good of the organization and the group, not just to individual gain. So again, the models in which we think about membership and rights and really having a voice inevitably mean that young people take on this notion that this is our community and I have a responsibility to protect it, not to abuse it. I just want to mention periodically that we have lots of programs out there, and if you look at the very bottom of this slide, the Child-to-Child program in Zambia, for me, is a very good example of enabling children to take on responsibilities for one another's health. And subsequent studies of that cohort of young people in the Child-to-Child program when they grew up, because leadership was egalitarian and girls had a voice, the attitudes of the men and women who were in the Child-to-Child program really changed as a result of those sorts of practices. Okay? Let me switch now to just briefly say, as Pat had raised, there's a lot of evidence that it's beneficial to individuals in terms of their health, in terms of their psychological well-being, in terms of the fact that they are less likely to engage in risk behaviors if they feel a sense of connection to institutions, if they feel a sense that they matter. Furthermore, longitudinal studies show that those young people who, when they're in middle school and high school, who feel that they're connected to community institutions are far more likely when they're adults to vote, to participate and join organizations. So what Pat's point about civic participation being both good for individuals and good for democracy has a lot of research evidence behind it. Okay. Now, I want to switch a little bit and raise the fact that the various reports were brought up in one of the talks yesterday, but I'll only draw attention to two. So the World Development Report from the World Bank, which focused on youth in the developing world, and then another report that came out the year before calling Growing Up Global. Each report, for the first time, named civic participation as one of the capabilities of adults. Okay? Remember, these are economists and demographers. So civic participation doesn't exactly like roll off of their tongue. Yet they saw this as a necessary part of becoming a full adult, along with schooling, work, health, and family formation. So in stating that, the World Bank and the Institute of Medicine Committee on Population were basically saying we need to seriously pay attention for the opportunities for learning that go beyond school and enable people to be full members of their society. I want to note that, however, that neither group was able to find very much research on this topic, okay, of civic participation. So there were case studies from one country or another, but nothing consistent across countries that enabled any kind of policy recommendations. Okay? Now here, this is a complicated slide. I only use it to make one point. This is done by a student from Korea named Taehan Kim. And there are some sources of data out there that go across countries, but I guess I want to suggest that one of the agendas we might think about in our discussions is how to make sure we collect more of that so that policymakers and practitioners can actually say, we know these kinds of practices enable civic participation. What I want to, Pat also alluded to the fact that there are various forms of civic participation, and what you see in the first two columns are two types of civic commitment, okay? The expectation that this 14-year-old will vote, and the expectation by the 14-year-olds who were in this study that they would join organizations, speak up, speak their mind, volunteer. And what you can see is the consistencies across countries or lack thereof. So in the column on the left, if the young person participated in extracurricular activities at school, okay, in most countries, they were likely to say, I expect to vote when I'm an adult, and I expect to express my opinion. At the same time, if they were involved in social causes, so these we might think of as the cutting-edge political activists, they were less inclined to think they would vote, possibly because they didn't actually believe in the process. But they were highly likely to say they would stay committed to social causes, environmental work, human rights work, etc. And I'll just briefly show you one other one. So positive teacher-student relations had a similar uneven effect on the kinds of civic commitments. So these are the students saying, teachers care about us at school, okay? The students who said that felt that they would vote as an adult, but they wouldn't speak up their mind. They wouldn't join social causes. They wouldn't have their voice representing them. Okay, I only have a few more slides and finish the end. We probably need in our conversations to get around to some common definition of what we mean by civic. Okay, it's certainly taken over the word political, but I want to just put some ideas out there that we might think about. I think civic implies a community. It implies a commons. It means that people are building something together because that's what the roots of community mean. Therefore, it means individuals don't do it alone. You cannot do civic work, I would argue, unless you do it with others, okay, around a common agenda. I want to also draw attention to the fact that we misunderstand often democracy as majority rule. If you look at the roots of the term, it actually means people's power. So if we don't have institutions and organizations that enable all the people, particularly the young people, as we're talking about at this meeting, to have power, to speak their voice, we are essentially not doing the work of democracy. Okay? Okay, last couple points. I think, although we have 3 strands at this meeting, I simply want to draw attention to the fact that there's intersections of these strands, okay? Civic engagement and peace building are clearly not foreign terms to one another, okay? Particularly if you think about intergroup relations moving from us and them, which we heard earlier this morning, to a sense of we in our community, particularly if you build in opportunities for gaining perspectives from others and seeing a common agenda. We also, I think, we haven't heard from the Transitions to Employment panel yet, but I want to argue that there's already models out there. Youth Build, the Community Cleaning Service in Nairobi, the Tap and Reposition Project, and many of the microfinance savings clubs that are based on notions of civic engagement in the here and now. Not on preparing people for doing something in the future, but saying you can gain employment skills and use them now to serve your community, okay? It's a very different way of thinking about preparation for employment than old models, which really were deficit models. What the new models, I would argue, say is you can act with your skills now to provide for your community. Okay, last slide, okay. These are just some thoughts about what we might think about as a civic agenda. We clearly don't want this meeting to be the end. We don't want to leave with a conversation. We want to sort of move this agenda forward in action. So I want to argue that we can begin to build a database. We've heard a lot about programs already here. We could have a common set of indicators that programs would use to evaluate themselves. For example, how diverse is your group on multiple dimensions? How heterogeneous are the experiences of young people? What are the opportunities for leadership? Are they egalitarian? Are they horizontal? Or are they vertical? Do many young people have chances to build their skills as leaders? We could begin to enable policymakers to think about the kinds of practices they want to see in organizations, community-based organizations, that will enable the civic skill development of the kind that we think are needed. And I want to emphasize hugely that we need to be thinking about young people as citizens in the present and not in preparation. So I end with one slide. Thank you. This is just a slide that was at a immigrant rights rally. And I mainly draw your attention to two things. The injury to one is an injury to all, for me, really represents the kind of solidarity that is characteristic of youth movements. And if you look in the back behind the young man with the red shirt, it also says, "Stop bullying." And what we see in the youth movements is a connection between the kind of civil societies they want in the spaces where they live, which are inclusive, as Kaylee talked about, and not bullying and not hierarchical, and the kind of society they want to be making and contributing to. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to have heard about this UNESCO conference from my good friend and colleague, Professor Pat Tolan, UNESCO Professor in NUI Galway, whom I've had the privilege of working with since I became Minister for Children and Youth Affairs in Ireland a year and a half ago. I wish you very good thinking and success at this conference on this most important topic. I became Minister, as I said, a year and a half ago. It's a full cabinet position in Ireland, the first time ever that we've had a senior minister. We've had it as a junior position before. And the reason I can't be with you today is because I'm in the middle of a referendum campaign in Ireland to articulate children's rights in the Constitution for the first time ever. Children are hardly mentioned in our Constitution. And on the 10th of November, Irish citizens will be asked to rectify that, to support an amendment which I'm putting to the people, supported by government. It's been a priority of government. And we do have a 20-year history of problems in this area and 17 major reports. But I will be putting the referendum to the people, as I said, on the 10th of November, articulating in the Constitution for the first time ever that children would be recognised as individual rights holders, very much in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That we will be very clear in this new constitutional amendment about how we protect children, clarity about children who are abused or neglected and state intervention. I'll also be dealing in that constitutional amendment with some inequalities in our constitution at the moment, where children of marital and non-marital parents are treated differently in relation to adoption. But very importantly, I'll also be asking the Irish people to support a reference in our Constitution that the best interests of the child should be paramount in decisions affecting that child, in court cases where adoption is being discussed, access, custody, all of those key issues that affect children's lives. And I'm also putting in to the article that changes our Constitution that the views and the voices of the child, depending on their age and maturity, should be heard in all decisions that affect them in these important court cases. So it's a referendum about children. A new article called Children will be put into our Constitution if the people support it. And so far I've got cross-party support in our Parliament, very interesting debates in our Dáil, which is our Parliament, and our Senate, over many hours in recent weeks. So it will now be up to the people. The referendum has got good support so far, but there are people who object. There are people who say you shouldn't give children individual rights, that it undermines the family. There are people who say that we shouldn't be spelling out this as clearly as we are. But I'm certainly hoping that on the 10th of November that people will support this strong statement about children's rights in the Irish Constitution. Of course, when I speak about children, I'm talking about children and young people up to the age of 18. So this referendum is about young children right up to 18, and it would affect all of those 1.1 million children in Ireland, specifically targeted at our most vulnerable children, of course, but a very symbolic statement, and also a statement in our Constitution that would have practical implications about how our children and young people are dealt with in a whole variety of settings, particularly in court settings where key decisions are being taken about our children and young people. Professor Pat Dolan is there with you, and if you have questions in relation to the referendum, I know he would be delighted, as a strong supporter of the referendum, he would be delighted to answer any questions about our forthcoming referendum. Of course, constitutional change is but one aspect of change for children. You also have to look at the resources any country is willing to invest. You have to look at best practice. You have to look what you're doing for all of the different age groups. And in terms of our young people and our young teenagers and youths, there's a lot happening in Ireland. There's huge interest in youth services, in creating services that are effective and efficient, that are researched, in working on issues like empathy and the roots of empathy, developing our young people's personality, skills, confidence, encouraging them to be involved in civic engagement. And of course, it's not just about involvement in politics, it's also about involvement in their communities, in civic life, in making a contribution, in being involved in active citizenship. And we see this in some of our big youth organisations like Feroiga and other organisations that work directly with young people. We see an extraordinary richness in what young people are being exposed to now in terms of youth work and contribution to community, being involved in local projects, doing anti-bullying workshops, addressing mental health issues, homophobic issues. Going around the country as Minister for Children and Youth Affairs in the last year and a half, I'm just so excited by what I see young people doing and the level of engagement which they have now in communities. And of course, there's huge personal development involved in that. I'm going to have an opportunity next year when Ireland has the presidency of the EU to take a number of initiatives in relation to young people, civic engagement and youth work. So that, for example, the EU policies are supporting this. We're going to be looking at youth work and the contribution of youth work and the standards that apply in youth work and how they contribute to young people developing their own skills, moving on to employment, education and training. And it's going to be very exciting because as Ireland holds the presidency, I have an opportunity to lead on the discussion about the role of youth work in civic engagement, the role of youth work in developing, for example, entrepreneurship in young people. And just recently I heard a very striking presentation that talked about, you know, you won't make an entrepreneur at 30, you make an entrepreneur at 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and 12 and 13 years of age. That's when you need to be supporting young people to be entrepreneurs. And I think youth work offers a great opportunity to do that. So we will have an international conference in Ireland in March, bringing together the best thinking in Europe about these issues. We will have a conference of experts together later in the year in June. And I would invite UNESCO and those of you attending the conference to be involved in whatever way you think is appropriate in that thinking at EU level and in Ireland during the presidency, because it's a great opportunity for us to develop our thinking about how best to work with young people. And we do need to do this because if you look at some of the challenges facing young people in Europe and beyond, one of our big challenges in Europe is about those very issues around employment, education and training, and that cohort of young people who are outside all of that. That's hugely challenging for every one of us. It's challenging for me, and I'm sure for everyone in the room. This challenge of how do we work with the young people who are so marginalised at the moment? How do we create the kind of services, give them the opportunity for civic engagement, the opportunities for training, for employment? And how can the work that we do with these young people in youth work and other services be that bridge to those opportunities for our young people? It's a great challenge, but I think there's huge opportunity there as well for us. In Ireland, we're very fortunate that one of the issues and initiatives that's given an impetus to much of the work that we're doing has come from philanthropy, for example, Atlantic Philanthropy. We've been very lucky to have the support for a lot of new and innovative programmes with young people from philanthropy, and it has made a huge difference because it's encouraged us to be innovative, to try new projects. It has supported the development of those new projects with a research basis as well, which is really important, because we really need to think, and I know going forward you will be discussing the kind of projects that need support. And I would say, for example, that one of the groups that we need to think more and more about are those marginalised young people in all our societies, those young people that the formal education system simply does not reach. For those young people, for example, who get expelled from school, it can be very difficult to find a way forward. And I think we really need to be examining very innovative practices in terms of, at a very early stage, identifying those young people who are not attending school, because it's a real first sign of problems. But for those young people who really are totally alienated from the school system, let's really think in a very innovative and research-based way about how we work with those young people, how youth work engages with them, how we can get the services to really find those young people, engage with them and continue to work with them, because they are the most vulnerable group. They are the group who will probably go on to experiment with drugs and alcohol. And if we can really find those innovative ways of working with them, it really will make a difference. One of the issues that emerges again and again in my work as Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, and I think preoccupies all policymakers and practitioners, such as all of you here today, is how do we do the kind of cross-departmental work and the cross-agency work that is necessary if we are to really effectively reach out to young people. For example, the setting up of my own Department of Children and making it a cabinet position was very much about doing that cross-departmental work. And I think in many governments around the world, we haven't really yet invented the ways in which departments work together. And we know if we're to reach out to our young people, our young teenagers, it's about different departments and agencies working together. It's about the departments of education and health and sport and environment, for example, amongst others, really working effectively together. So I think one of the areas in the future that we need to examine much more, and I would really invite UNESCO to help us with this, is to think about what are the models that we need to create in modern government structures that effectively do this. Because we do think very often in silos and separate departments and separate agencies. And what's very clear from all of the reports that I get, that very often you have many agencies working with young people or working in communities. But what we need is better cross-departmental, cross-agency work, pooling of resources, especially at a time of economic difficulty. So I think the models and the innovative ideas that would help us to do this would be very welcome. And certainly I would be prepared to play my role as Minister for Children and Youth Affairs in Ireland with UNESCO. And I know that the UNESCO professors here, both in Belfast and in Galway, would be very interested in doing this as well. And I know that Ireland, that we will play our role in these initiatives that you are taking forward. One of the ways I'm approaching the development of our initiatives in relation to children and young people in Ireland is to develop an approach to each part of the life stage, if you like, so that, for example, I've set up an early years group for the first time in Ireland, looking at national policy around those very early years, looking at the childhood years and the adolescent years, and looking at policy in each of those areas, and then having a whole of government approach to each of those, and making sure that my government colleagues and other departments are involved in the development of that policy. And of course, a very important part of our work is the participation of young people. Article 12 of the Convention, giving voice to young people. And we've made a lot of progress in that regard. As I said earlier, we're now going to put that into the Constitution, which is a real step forward to ensure that the voices of young people are heard so that they can become more effective citizens. But equally, we've developed a lot of innovative ways in which young people are being consulted at local level and at national level. We're creating more and more space to hear the voice of young people. And it does take getting used to, I think. It's not always as easy as people think it is. And even if we're committed to it at a theoretical level, making it happen in practice takes practice. You've got to get into it and start doing it, creating those spaces. So we have a youth parliament, we have county structures where young people get together and talk about problems in their own county area. And also, obviously, in the youth work services, the whole participation, the direct participation of young people, of course, is what in the longer term makes them effective citizens and gives them the opportunity. But they have to be very directly deciding on that practice that really can change their lives. A very practical example of it I had just a few days ago was where we had a meeting with young people who've been in the care system, and a new organisation that has been founded to give them a voice directly about their experiences in the care system and their suggestions for improvement in the care system. And it was a very powerful morning to hear the voices directly of young people who'd been in care and their suggestions for changing how the state services had dealt with them. And it was a very refreshing morning and a very positive morning. And it was the kind of morning that people might have been nervous about before. But giving that voice was really important, and that was a really good practice. And at the end of the day, when you're out there in the field, the policy is about seeing the practice really in action and seeing the initiatives that people are taking as a result of the policy development and the research. And it's great to see the initiatives that are taking place in Ireland and internationally that give young people more voice.
Good afternoon. The message of this forum is that policies affecting young people should be developed with those young people, that this will improve the relevance of these policies, and that it will also strengthen the democratic participation of young people. But in saying this, we need to recognize that policy making is not an entirely technical exercise. Policies are shaped by politics, by contestation between powerful interest groups, political parties, business, trade unions, civil society groups, lobby groups, religious organizations. So when we think and talk about how we can get young people's voices heard, we need to talk about how we can get young people organized, how we can get young people mobilized around youth unemployment, poor quality education, child labor, forced marriages, girls' access to education, all of the issues that affect them. I'm a part of a movement called Equal Education. Our aim is to ensure that every child in South Africa has access to a quality education. We pursue this aim through grassroots organizing, social mobilization, media and advocacy work, and litigation. Our members are mainly poor high school students and their parents, those most directly affected by the education crisis in South Africa. In my country, in reality, there are two public education systems. One system is functional, well-managed, and well-resourced. It serves the richest 25% of children whose parents can afford to send them to these high-performing schools. The other education system is dysfunctional, poorly resourced, and underperforming, and it serves 75% of our children, all of them poor and black. Now, like Kaylee, I'm from Cape Town, which is in the Western Cape province of South Africa, and this is the second most wealthiest province in the country. And on national education tests, the Western Cape, in terms of its averages, always does amongst the best in the country. But if you look closely at educational performance in the province, you'll begin to understand something about educational inequality in South Africa. So every 2 years, the Western Cape Education Department, they test grade 3 and grade 6 learners in literacy and numeracy. So they test them on their ability to read and write and to count and do basic arithmetic. Now, in 2008, 53.5% of grade 3 students passed the literacy test. Okay, that's 53.5% pass. But if you were to look closely at this figure, you'd see that students, both black and white, but middle class, who attend former whites-only schools, these schools were classified as whites-only under apartheid, 88.9% of these students passed those literacy tests. And if you were to compare this to students at black schools, which are still only attended by poor black learners, 42.3% of learners passed the literacy test. Now the numeracy scores were even worse. So there was a 34.9% average of grade 3 students who passed these numeracy tests. 80.5% of students at former whites-only schools passed. This compared to 16.2% of students at black schools. The results of this failure to instill basic literacy and numeracy skills are disastrous. Half of all South African children drop out of school before their final year. And as our Minister of Higher Education said yesterday, more than 3 million young people between the ages of 18 and 24 are not in school, are not in any tertiary institutions, and are not working. And with an unemployment rate of around 36%, the reality is that most of these children, most of these young people will probably never be employed. Now there are many reasons why our education system is so poor and unequal. Chief among them is the historical legacy of apartheid, which deliberately invested little in black education. This left us with a massive infrastructure backlog, weak institutions, and poorly trained teachers. But there were also very poor policy choices made after 1994 when we achieved democracy. And there is a serious lack of accountability at all levels of our education system. Equal education works primarily in Khayelitsha, which is a large township, a poor urban settlement in Cape Town, with a population of around 1 million people. Now, most of these people live in zinc and wooden shacks, have limited access to basic services like water, electricity, and sanitation. There is a high rate of drug, alcohol, and sexual abuse, and crime and unemployment is rife too. Schools in Khayelitsha achieve some of the worst educational outcomes in the Western Cape. Equal education members attend weekly meetings. This is where they learn about politics, they learn about inequality, they learn about history, law, and activism. It's also a space for them to talk about issues in their schools and in their communities, and for them to develop skills and campaigns that will allow them to effectively confront these issues. Since 2008, Equal Education members have led campaigns against poor school infrastructure, late coming, a lack of textbooks, corporal punishment and brutality in schools, illegal exclusions of learners, and school closures. Through their involvement in the organization, and through their involvement in our organization, young people develop a political understanding and consciousness. They learn how inequality is structured and how that is reproduced on a daily basis. But they also learn the activist skills, the leadership skills, which will allow them to confront these challenges. But being a part of an organization, being a part of a political organization like ours, is not only about the hard skills that one learns. It's also, as Connie mentioned earlier, about developing a sense of belonging, of mattering. And these young people are a part of an organization. It's a central part of their identity. They refer to themselves as equalizers. They learn how to work together in teams. They learn how to discuss and debate and how to formulate arguments. They learn how to resolve conflict, how to plan and execute tasks, how to manage their time. These are all of the skills, these are all of the advantages of being involved in youth activism and being involved in these organizations like Equal Education. So the point that I want to make and restate here today is that policies and policy making takes place on contested political terrain, and young people and the voice of young people, for that to be expressed, for their views to be articulated, for their interests to be included within policies. If we are going to be talking about that, then we need to be thinking and talking about how do we capacitate youth organization, how do we strengthen the power of youth, how do we strengthen their political voice and their political power. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. I'm not going to even begin to try to synthesize or summarize these very rich presentations. I just do want to say there's at least one obvious and clear common theme here with regard to youth participation, and this is to do with the notion of citizenship, right, and how we promote youth to be productive citizens, not just down the road, but today. How do we engage them collectively, socially, and politically, both in the politics of contention, as Brad talked about, and in what might be called the sort of politics of everyday life, right? What are the spaces, what are the processes, what are the mechanisms, what are the ways in which that can be promoted, what are the ways in which policy can support it, and what are the things we need to know? What can research do to help inform those processes? So we have about 15 minutes. I'm going to open it up to questions. Maybe we'll take one at a time and see how many we can get in. So who has questions for the panel? Yes, ma'am.
Hello? Yeah. My name is Tolulope Shongosoya from Nigeria. I noticed that my government representative is not here. So I don't know who would help me talk to them about involving the youth in policy making. Because there are lots of young people doing great things in Nigeria, but no collective pool, like he spoke about. How do we bring all these young people doing things individually together to solve a national problem? Thank you.
Thank you. So the question is about how does one create collective action among young people? Yeah. These microphones, I think, will work.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. When we talk about young people being involved in organizations and increasing their power, obviously that means mobilizing young people, but that also means seeking out very important allies. The natural allies of young people, students, are their parents, and also around issues of unemployment are the workers. So it's also very important that when young people speak, that they try and speak with a united voice, and that's why coalitions are very important. Coalitions are how small organizations in different communities and in different places can come together and develop a clear set of programs and an agenda which they can then use to advocate on. And that's very important. I think that in the NGO sector and amongst youth organizations, we are small, usually, and that we need to find ways of working together, and we need to find ways of pushing programs that will unite us and that will move all young people forward.
Anyone else?
I think working with my personal experience, when we started the campaign, it was just 5 of us who had this plan. And as we were motivated about it, other people got more excited. And I think it's important to start and not to be so set on planning everything before it happens, because then we don't actually get to do anything.
Do you want to contribute? Okay. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. My name is Emily Chesa, and I work with Save the Children. I just want to highlight the fact that the issue about us versus them is not really confined to the youth alone, and I see it as a thread that is going through the entire debate and global issues. For example, when we discuss about the youth riots, I would have wanted to hear more about the UK riots, where the youth were leading in 2010 in summer, the riots that are going on in Greece right now. I've heard a lot about projects on youth that are in Africa or in Asia or in South America. And I would want this to also be expanded more beyond looking at Africa, Asia, South America as projects, but also as thinkers, seeing more academics from the South. For example, in Africa, we have professors who really have different views and different opinions and see things from a different place. And the youth issue being a big elephant, we see it from different perspectives. And if we put all our thinking together, we'll come up with a grand solution. Thank you.
So I'm not sure there's a question there, but a statement about broader inclusion.
Yes, hello. I was wondering if maybe some of the different panelists might speak to the aspect of violence and youth violence, whether that be expressed in the form of gangs, as one might see in Central or Latin America, or in the United States, or in Europe, on the one hand, but also youth propensity to be recruited into violent groups. And the piece that I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on is the roots, the social fabric that would produce something like that, or the lack of social fabric, and what policymakers and youth activists can do to encourage different kinds of more supportive, positive social fabric.
In the community where we do most of our organizing in Kailicha, there's actually a very serious problem of young people, school-going young people getting involved in gangs and serious gang violence. In the last 2 years, 5 of our members have been killed, have been murdered by other young people. You know, young people and our schools are violent, and the communities in which they're located are violent too. So what's happening in homes is being reflected in schools. I think that's the first point that I want to make. What we found is that just talking to young people and telling them, you shouldn't be involved in this gangs, you know, you could end up in jail, you could die, that's not enough. There needs to be an alternative. So in our community, there isn't really after-school sport, there isn't drama, there isn't extracurricular activities. There's not a way for young people to develop a sense of identity, a sense of achievement, a sense of personal value outside of joining a gang where there's status, where you matter, where you are seen as being someone of importance. And if you're not seen as important at home and in your community, you look for other ways in which you can exercise this, where you can exercise that sense of value and worth and dignity that we all want. And so I think that we need to, in terms of this issue, we need to be providing alternatives to young people to develop a more positive sense of identity.
People here? Can we turn the volume up?
We'll try this one. In terms of disability and violence, children with disabilities specifically are very vulnerable to abuse, and I think there's also a sense of violence that's less seen when children are ignored and their needs aren't met. And it leads to very negative experiences for these kids. But I think to avoid the violence, we need more people in the communities who are there to guide the people away from the violent situations.
Tommy, anything to add? No? Okay. All right. So time for one final question, gentleman in the back. Sir.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je voudrais, à travers justement ce...
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to pay homage to the testimony that we've just heard and the person who gave it. I would also like to salute what's being done in South Africa. And my question is as follows. Well, my questions are as follows. The first one goes to Kaylee Mycroft. First question for Kaylee Mycroft. So, let me begin my first question. Through your very difficult situation, have you been able to understand the disabilities in South Africa among populations of half-breeds and blacks throughout apartheid? Were you able to understand their disabilities as well? And through your experience, could it be possible to pool skills and knowledge so that you can come up with a South African society of the tomorrow based on the solidarity among all populations because they all have a common destiny? Because up until now, there's been a great separation between the half-castes, the blacks and the whites. But as regards the future of South Africa, shouldn't it not be one united country? I'm fairly familiar with South Africa, and I like it, and I have a lot of friends in South Africa. My final question is for... Sorry, I'm looking for your name, so I don't mispronounce it. For Constance, who's from the American University. You began by saying that the dominant model is being challenged. That model which is based on the promotion of wealth and celebrity. And that seems to be the dominant model still. Now, I mean, how far have your studies gone and how much weight do they carry within the American system, where culture seems to be fashioned by the media? And what's the degree of engagement in America? Because the Americans seem to think that what's good for America is good for the whole world, politically speaking. So, what about the financial crisis? That's an illustration. That's something that started off in the US. It's become an economic and political, and now it's a social crisis with immeasurable outcomes. And we don't see any really solid movement to challenge that system, which is generating damage right throughout the world. So that would help me to measure the extent of civic engagement on the part of the Americans. Thank you.
Two very big questions and very little time. But Kaylee, did you understand and hear the question?
I wasn't.
The question is about whether you've been able to learn based on what you've learned through your disability to understand the challenges faced by other marginalized groups in South Africa, and is there a way that you see for all these groups to come forward to create a common cause and a common...
Okay. People with disabilities have always been marginalized forever in South Africa. And I think I'm a very determined person, and I was determined to be included, and I was raised inclusively, and I think the first thing that we need to do is to realize that there is a problem, and be willing to stand up and be counted, because so many groups that are marginalized feel that it's always going to be that way, so they don't do anything about it. And I think if we can, each group decide that we are actually going to do something, I definitely think that there would be change and more inclusion, and yeah.
Is this on now? No?
Can you hear?
Is it on? Yeah. So I completely agree with you that too long we've exported American models of all kinds of things, and we better be beyond that. That said, there is a tradition in the United States of public schooling being a right and a necessity for democracy. We do have a historical tradition for that. I mean, that's being eroded because there are major attacks on public education, and there's increasingly tax dollars being taken from the public to privatization. So we have a serious problem about the public getting educated in American education. There is research that basically says if young people feel that the reason they're in school is to get rich, to use a shorthand, is just to succeed for themselves, they don't maintain an intrinsic interest in learning for very long. Whereas young people who feel like they're interested in learning and interested in other people's ideas maintain that interest for a really long time. So, and the last thing I'll say is that the whole civic development and civic engagement discussion has really enlarged the discussion of public education, so that it's not just performance of academics and human capital as the reason for going to school. In fact, there's evidence that young people who are at risk of dropping out because they're not feeling like they're wanted in the institution, when they're enabled to do engaged learning through community service, for example, actually stay longer. So enlarging the whole purpose of education and the way in which this forum is talking about it, I think, includes young people in ways that education needs to include them and not just have a narrow definition.
So we have much more to say about all these things, but we are out of time. I want to thank the panel and the presenters for their very excellent contributions.